The Viking Age is usually considered as the 8th to 11th centuries. The Vikings were a group of people from Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Vikings are most well known for being fierce warriors who went raiding and pillaging. They used special long ships with a shallow draft to travel across seas but also to sail up rivers. They could sail in water as shallow as 1 meter. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were also farmers, traders and explorers. They were well-traveled, visiting Russia to the east, Constantinople to the south, and even reaching North America to the west. Leif Erikson traveled from Greenland to North America almost 500 years before Christopher Columbus. The first Viking raids began in the late 8th century. The Vikings began attacking monasteries in Anglo-Saxon Britain. This is because monasteries were an easy target. The monks were unarmed and there was treasure, and other valuables, to steal from them. One of the first recorded attacks was at a monastery on Lindisfarne in 793 CE, an island just off the coast of northeast England. Over the next few decades, the Vikings would regularly visit Britain and other countries to raid them. However, from 866 CE, they started to settle in Britain, eventually managing to take over all but one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They had several reasons for wanting to take land elsewhere. Firstly, the land in Scandinavia was not very good for farming. Norway was too hilly, Sweden was covered in dense forests and Denmark's soil was too sandy. Secondly, more settlements in other countries made it easier for the Vikings to set up trade routes. As you can see above, the Vikings had a social hierarchy or class system. However, unlike other medieval class systems, it was possible to move up or down depending how your life turned out. Thralls were slaves. They had no rights in Viking society, and were used as a form of currency. Most slaves were people who had been captured during a war, or born to a slave. However, it was possible to become a slave if you lost your wealth. Carls were the poorer people of Viking society. However, they were different from the thralls in that they were free and had full rights. This meant they could own land, fight and speak at the Thing, an assembly where decisions were made and laws were created or changed, and disputes were settled. Jarls were at the top of the class system, until kings and queens were introduced in the latter half of the Viking Age. They were the wealthy Vikings who usually did not need to do any hard work during their lives. They controlled large amounts of land and were responsible for maintaining law and order. They were also leaders of the military in their region and in charge of defending the land. Later, kings and queens replaced the Jarls. However, the Jarls still held a lot of power, and could rule in place of a king if they were sick, or otherwise unable to rule. Viking men were generally in charge of raids and trades, while women stayed at home. There is evidence of female Viking warriors, such as the one found buried in Birka, Sweden. However, it was not as common as it appears in movies and television. Viking women did have more rights than in other medieval societies. They could choose whether or not they wanted to marry someone, and could get a divorce if the marriage didn't work out. However, they were not allowed to attend the Thing, could not inherit from men, and they were officially classed as inferior to men. Finally, Vikings lived in a building called a longhouse. There weren't many Viking towns. Most settlements were made up of a few farms gathered together. The homes were built of wood, usually covered in clay to block out the wind and cold. They would have a wooden, or thatched roof. In the middle of the house was the fireplace. It was used for cooking, but also to keep the house warm during the winter. Viking houses did not have windows, so a small hole would be cut in the roof to allow the smoke from the fire to leave. If a farm didn't have separate buildings for the animals, then part of the house was usually blocked off to keep the animals safe.